going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 48 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Today, we have a pretty cool episode. So, Zach will be discussing a recent study looking at the concept of maintenance doses for maintaining muscle mass. So, essentially, lowering your training volume to what degree, and can you still expect to see muscle retention? And I think some of the details Zach is going to talk about today are often overlooked, and maybe we're going to propose a little bit of like a shift in the narrative, if you will. And that might not seem like the sexiest topic right off the bat, right? Like maintenance isn't the most interesting, again, right off the bat. But I think there are a lot of downstream implications, even for folks that are interested in maximizing everything to the nth degree. So, with that out of the way, check out the description of the podcast, whether you're on YouTube or podcasts app, whether that's Apple Podcast, Spotify, or if I did convert you last episode, if you're on Overcast, you should be able to find it there too. Check out the stuff we offer in the description of the podcast. Leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And yeah, we appreciate you tuning in. So with that out of the way, Zach, you can go ahead and let us know about this study and wherever else you want to take it.
Yeah, for sure. Quick ad break for Overcast. I have been completely converted.
Did you download it?
I downloaded it. Not
Nice.
only did I download it, I also went to the Apple Podcast app and deleted every single podcast that was being carried on that to save space on my phone, as I was quickly converted once I saw all the features that were available. So
it's good, right?
Overcast, if you're listening to this episode, please would love to have you as a first sponsor.
Have you tried the voice boost feature?
Yeah, I've tried. I was playing around with everything, like the micro adjustments to the speed. Obviously, the smart speed was the main feature you talked about last time.
Yeah.
And then the voice boost and everything. It just has a ton of good features for sure.
Yeah, I recently switched from Apple Music to Spotify, and I was like, oh, this will be awesome. I can listen to podcasts in Spotify too, because basically everything is there these days. And I just couldn't do it. I listened to like one or two podcasts. I just couldn't do it. I had to go back to Overcast. So Spotify is definitely superior for music, but not for podcasts.
Yeah, for sure.
Overcast.
Okay. Yeah, that I just wanted to throw that in there because I was. If it was just like this is better, but it was like substantially better. So definitely, if you're not listening to it on Overcast,
we got to pay the bills. So
exactly. All right. So yeah, I was. If you listen to the last podcast, we talked about changes in training volume more so in the positive direction. So in the sense of like, if we increase training volume by X%, what does that do in terms of our gains in muscle mass? When we were going through that conversation, we always have a list of kind of topics that we want to write about in these newsletters. That the opposite end of that was on my list for a while, but that conversation just got me really excited to kind of dig into it more. And as Josh said, this topic, for whatever reason, is just one that even us, I know we've kind of said the bumper sticker quote in the past, but I knew that a few studies existed that would kind of challenge that narrative in the population, that people kind of bring up this anecdote we're going to talk about in a little bit, not anecdote, but quote. And ultimately, it's just a lot more to the story, I think, than maybe meets the eye, in particular in this topic. So as Josh said, the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about is, okay, why is maintenance important? Obviously, we're most of the time we're talking about maximizing outcomes in this podcast, talking about those little things you can do that add up to make hopefully a meaningful difference when you're kind of crossing your T's and dotting your I's. But for a variety of reasons, I think maintenance is something that can be important. Specifically in the instance of doing less volume, which is what we're going to talk about in this episode. I think there's a few things that come to mind. Obviously, the first one is just time constraints. When you are limited by time, being able to do less volume and maintain or even slightly, gain adaptations while just doing less overall work is going to be beneficial as far as that goes. And if you pair that with drop sets, like we talked about in a previous episode, man, now we're really saving some time. Other than that, obviously during injuries, sometimes when you're working through injuries, you might want to decrease volume to allow yourself to recover, but hopefully not lose many of the adaptations that you've worked really hard to get. And then finally, the most relevant to the last episode of the podcast would be, if you're trying out a specialization cycle and you're kind of in the off muscle group. We talked about this a little bit, but how much should I bring down the de-emphasized muscle group? Sometimes you're not going to bring it down at all. You're going to kind of sit at that habitual volume. But if you're really trying to prioritize something and you're trying to keep the overall level of training success relatively similar, you might want to know how much to pull that back. In addition, kind of dropping that below your habitual levels, and knowing how much volume it takes to maintain adaptations is going to be informative to that as well. So
Can
those are
I
just yeah, go ahead.
can I add something else? I'd also add
Thanks for
deloads into
raising your
that.
hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I just realized there's a raise hand feature in the software we use, so that's pretty cool. Typically, we're like waving each other down. But I don't think you mentioned deloads. I'd add that one in there as well. It's 1 week here and there, but if you kind of zoom out, you're like, all right, 52 weeks in the year, I'm deloading every 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. It's like that's a decent amount of your training time. So understanding how much is that at least enough work to maintain the adaptations you've gained throughout the previous weeks, I think is also worth consideration.
100%. Yeah, that's another really good example. So just to kind of get us kicked off here, I think the discussion is going to be considerably more broad than this first study I'm going to kind of introduce, but this will kind of just get us started, similar to how I do in the newsletter. But there was a new study by Braz and colleagues that kind of, I say in the newsletter, just kind of kicks off this discussion. And what they did initially, it was a within participant design. So as we've said in the podcast before, this is where you take one person and you're randomizing their limbs to different conditions. So in this case, one limb did a low frequency training protocol where they trained 2 times per week, and the other limb did a high frequency training protocol where they trained 4 times per week. Most importantly, they then took the high frequency limb and split that into 2 additional conditions after 4 weeks. So that's really where the comparison that we care about is. So they took that high frequency limb and split half of the limbs into a basically 50% decrease in volume. So they were training 2 times per week now with basically the same session workout, but just decreasing those workouts by 2. And the other limb just completely detrained. And these were pretty well trained participants. I really like it when they kind of describe the participant training, because that can kind of give us an additional indication past just resistance training years to kind of know what kind of training they were doing, things like that. And they described how many sets per week they were performing prior to the study, which was like 27.4. That was maybe a little bit high. If you're training really, really challenging sets, like the proximity failure is pretty accurate. That's going to be a high amount of training, but obviously exercise selection and things like that play a role in that as well. So we don't really know some of those details, but nonetheless, they were performing a good amount of training. I think the training experience was over 3 years. So pretty well-trained folks. And ultimately, when we're talking about these maintenance volumes, that is the factor that I think isn't highlighted nearly enough. We'll talk about another study here in a little bit that gets generalized a lot of the time, but the training status just simply isn't the same as the populations that we're often trying to generalize these findings to. And so just to briefly glaze over the results in the Braz study, they trained with the leg extension exercise. So I think that's an important point to point out. We know from other data that primarily the kind of the adaptations that are the most focused from the leg extension exercise are probably going to happen in the rectus femoris. It's a biarticular muscle that's going to suit itself well to the leg extension exercise. And ultimately, the 50% decrease in training volume allowed for a little bit of continued growth in that muscle, while the complete detraining group, they lost muscle mass. Pretty intuitive findings there, but it's important to kind of think about that from the perspective of that maintenance dose in these trained individuals. Decreasing the volume to what they were performing by about 50% was able to maintain or slightly keep increasing the rectus femoris. Now, a few caveats to this, and that's why we're going to kind of dig into a few other studies after this to kind of build the overall body of evidence. The first thing is that the volumes in this study potentially were a little bit unrealistic. I got a couple comments about this on Instagram, which are totally fair. I don't think it's something we can totally know based on the way it's described in the methods. It could have been 48 sets per week in the high frequency condition, or it could have been 24 sets per week in the high frequency condition. It's not really adequately described. So that's why I kind of put a little bit of caution in the way those were described and when I talked about the study. But ultimately, it was a good amount of training volume, either way you slice it, 24 or 48. The reason I went with 48 in the way that I described it, as we talked about, these people were performing quite a few sets coming into the study, so they were kind of habituated to that. So an increase in training volume from that might not have been totally unrealistic. And so when we're looking at that, the reason I think that's relevant is because when they were decreasing their training volume, if they were doing 48 sets per week, they still would have been near the range of their habitual volumes. And so that could also play into a role based on what we discussed in the last episode of the podcast. They weren't really decreasing their training volume relative to what they were habitually performing that much. Of course, they did to what they were performing in the last 4 weeks, but who's to say that's entirely representative of the volumes that they're actually dropping that training volume from? Thus, as we always say with one study, it's not going to entirely paint the picture, but this is good to know and kind of leads us into the next discussion. But based on that, Josh, you have any points before I keep rolling here?
No, sounds like you kind of, are assuming it was 48 sets per week to failure, which is a lot.
And
It
there's
was
two
it was
reasons why I
leg
think that's
extensions though, right?
yes, there's two reasons why I think that's the case. It was leg extension, and the rest periods were 60 seconds. If the rest periods were 60 seconds, I have a strong suspicion, just based on our kind of experience and research, that was chosen to save time per session, as opposed to if they were doing 6 sets per session, a more standard rest period of somewhere in
It's
the
a
range
very
of
quick session, yeah.
2 to 3 minutes would have probably been employed. So the 60-second rest period, in my mind, kind of hints at the fact that it probably was 12 sets per session. So in the high frequency group, that would be 48 sets per week.
Do you, do you recall how well they grew those first 4 weeks? Because you didn't put it in the newsletter because that wasn't really the
Yeah,
focus. But I'm just
exactly.
curious. Like,
I made an Instagram post about it. Let
I'd
me double
assume. Oh yeah,
check.
that's right. I'd assume they grew, right? But I'm curious how well they grew because
Yeah,
48,
so
48 sets a week is a lot. But on the leg extension by that 12th set, it's more or less cardio. So I think the point to drive home is that like, yeah, 48 sets to failure is unrealistic with the way most people train and probably should train. But in this context, at least both groups did that right. And you're comparing more junk volume to like kind of less junk volume.
yeah, it was an interesting study. So won't get too far off in this direction, but I do think it is kind of interesting based on one of the other previous newsletters we talked about training frequency. The interesting thing about this one is that they measured muscle size, in this initial design where one limb's performing low frequencies and one limb's performing high frequencies, but they did it after a fixed number of sessions. So they measured muscle size in the 2 times a week limb after 8 weeks, whereas in the 4 times a week limb after 4 weeks. And basically, they saw equivalent muscle growth in those time frames, indicating that the higher frequency limb that was also performing more volume may have facilitated faster rates of progress, but not an absolute greater amount of muscle growth, if that makes sense. Obviously,
Interesting.
we don't know if that would have continued to be the case and ultimately lead to better outcomes after 8 weeks, but nonetheless, I do think that that's interesting. One thing I didn't do, but I think you could potentially do, is add the changes from the 4 weeks and then the 50% maintenance dose and see if that led to higher overall outcomes after 8 weeks. I didn't do that. I would assume that might have allowed for slightly greater hypertrophy, but obvious caveat there, that would be a greater total number of sets performed in the higher frequency condition, which would probably more so indicate that higher frequencies are permissive of greater volumes being productive, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, interesting study for sure.
Yeah, sweet. But good news for the listeners: if you were lost, don't worry about it because the actually relevant part of the study is going to be described. That's kind of like Zach zoned in on the second half of this study for
Yep,
the
exactly.
newsletter.
Yeah, and so it's really just to summarize the second half of the study one more time before we move on. Is really all we're saying there is that a 50% maintenance dose of volume relative to what they were performing for the prior 4 weeks roughly seems to allow for the maintenance of muscle mass in pretty well trained individuals. In contrast to the next study we're going to talk about, which is the study by Bickle and colleagues. So the study by Bickle and colleagues gets talked about a ton, and it's a really, really good study. I want to be very clear about that. It has nothing to do with the study itself. This is one of the best, well done studies in exercise science for sure. It's just the fact that we take the population that it's done in and extrapolate it into populations that are, probably not even remotely similar to the one that was studied. So, brief overview of the Bickel study. Initial 16-week training period. So they take completely untrained individuals. There's actually two cohorts of individuals. They took young individuals and elderly individuals. I'm going to focus on the young folks just because that is a majority of our population that we kind of get listeners from. And so they had that initial 16-week training period, pretty standard training program, progressive overload, all that good stuff. Then after 16 weeks, they split the same people into three different groups. One group completely detrained and just stopped training for 32 weeks. The two other groups performed maintenance training. One of them performed a third of the training volume they performed in that initial 16-week training period, and the other one performed a ninth of the initial volume that they performed in the 16-week training period. And just for a little bit of context, the initial training period was 3 times a week training, 3 sets per session. The one-third condition just did 1 session per week for 3 sets. And then the 1/9 condition did 1 session per week for 1 set. So they're basically just taking, how many sets they did per week and distributing that into 1 session to get the different maintenance doses. And so just a very, very broad overview here in the young individuals, if we're looking at the mean fiber area, which kind of combines all the fiber level outcomes, type 1, type 2, they saw that detraining lost mean fiber area, pretty intuitive. The 1/3 condition allowed them to probably still gain a little bit of mean fiber area over the 32 weeks. And the 1/9 condition probably allowed for maintenance for the most part in the young individuals. And so the kind of bumper sticker tagline that this study often gets people to say is that basically you can maintain training adaptations with about 1/9 of the training volume that it took to kind of establish those adaptations in the first place, which coming from this data set is a very fair conclusion. That's absolutely what happened. And I think that's a very fair takeaway. But the fact that these individuals were completely not exposed to resistance training for, I think, about 5 years. So the one thing I mentioned in the article is that I think most people, kind of the average person that's kind of evidence-based interested, kind of looks at some articles, reads some studies every now and again. I would say for the most part, even those people would consider people that don't consistently train or don't consistently try to like achieve progressive overload. So maybe you're going to the gym once or twice, every couple weeks. They would say those people are untrained. You know what I mean? Whereas in this case, they're not doing anything for 5 years. So that's a very, very sedentary, untrained individual. I just think that's a completely different story than even somebody who kind of exercises every now and again, but is completely unfocused. This is like absolutely zero training. So even more so to being, untrained, they're completely untrained. So I think it's double in that sense of hopefully not extrapolating these findings. You got something to say?
Yeah. Another consideration here is, we're kind of talking about maintenance volumes in terms of like relative to how they got those adaptations, right? So in this case, in the Bickel study, they were doing 9 sets per week, and then one group dropped down to 3 sets per week, and one group dropped down to 1 set per week. So 1/3 and 1/9 respectively. Whereas in the Braz study, they went from 48 sets to 24. So, that's a 50% decrease, but the absolute volumes are so much different. Have you put any thought into how that kind of interacts here? And we can also put this question off a little bit because I know you're still kind of running through things, but that's something that comes to mind as quite apparent when comparing these two studies.
Yeah, just making a note. That's a really good point, and it's one of the many limitations on this kind of just general look at things. I think my overall goal for this was, I was talking to you initially when I was kind of putting things together, and I was thinking about kind of trying to pull some things together and kind of look at like an overall relationship. But the more I dug into it, I quickly realized there's just so many things that we would need for that to be like strongly established or something I'd be confident in, that it ultimately to me was just about, here is a reasonable possibility based on the data that we have let's make educated recommendations based on experience for the most part on which direction should we lean with the data that we do have established that is a little bit more direct in looking at this question. So the Bickle study really directly looks at this question. Like I said, an awesome study. But we need to use these other areas of evidence that we're going to talk about to say, okay, there's a line here where the Bickle study actually examined which side of the fence are we going to sit on based on our experience and some of this other evidence. That's ultimately what I was trying to do here. And then some of the questions that you mentioned, I do think are obviously areas that we'd love to see follow-up research on this, because I do think this is like a very, very practical question. And ultimately, I think we just need more data on this, but we'll definitely come back to that because I think that's a huge point.
Yeah.
Um,
Ultimately, it's like, hey, this Bickle study does a hell of a job looking at this question, but like, guys, they were completely untrained. And I want to take this as an opportunity to quickly mention something, and Zach, feel free to chime in if you want to. Is like, I think we've mentioned on the show before, and I would generally hold this position in that, people will look at a training study and be like, oh, if they use untrained subjects or not well trained subjects, then we kind of have to throw that study out the door. We don't take that position because we're unaware of many. I can't even think of any off the top of my head in which the directionality of that or the general concept wouldn't apply both to both populations, right? An untrained cohort and a well trained cohort. But the differences probably come when you're trying to give objective recommendations, right? So I think of like, okay, the general relationship that additional volume leads to additional hypertrophy. That's probably going to be present for untrained and trained folks. But where you might run into issues is when you try to take a blanket volume recommendation and apply it to every single population. Same idea here is that, okay, we see this general concept that it takes less work to maintain adaptations than the work that was done to get those adaptations. However, what we're saying is, the recommendation that's off the bumper sticker, as you put it, Zach, that's often thrown around of 1/9 of what you got to get those adaptations probably should be applied with caution. Or at least we're saying, hey, let's look into this a little bit further. Let's see what other lines of research we have that have a ton of other limitations, as we've talked about with the Braz study, as we're going to talk about with some of the tapering research. But these are other things to keep in mind. And, of course, there's practical considerations here. But I just wanted to mention that, if we're trying to extrapolate a given a given study that used untrained individuals, we should be wary of the actual numbers we're applying, but the directionality probably makes sense.
100%. The key difference in this case is that, like you said, we are directly commenting on the magnitude rather than the directionality of this relationship. Yes, there seems to be pretty solid evidence to say you can maintain adaptations with less overall training than it took to establish those adaptations. But now we're saying, okay, based on the population you fall within, how much? That is referring to the magnitude rather than the directionality. We're not saying that trained individuals actually need more volume than they originally took to get the adaptations. Like that would be questioning the directionality of the relationship, which is not what we're doing. So yeah, I think that's an awesome point.
Right on.
So yeah, like I said, ultimately the Bickle study is really, really solid. It's just very limited in the population that it kind of investigates. And so when people apply this study and kind of throw it out there and bring it up in these discussions, I think it's well placed because, like I said, it's one of the only studies that really directly looks at this question. But like we said, this is one of those conversations where magnitude is ultimately what we're after. So these contextual factors do matter a ton because we're ultimately trying to deliver a recommendation that is somewhat has a some sort of specificity to it to a certain population. So that's where the body of evidence that I think is really, really helpful to kind of help add some context here is there's all these tapering studies. And I think we've brought this up on previous podcasts where basically the reason this is relevant is we have people that are training, prior to this tapering period. They measure muscle size pre-tapering, and then they decrease training volume varying percentages for anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks, and then they measure muscle size again. That's kind of the studies that we're interested in. Now, as Josh said, there's numerous limitations that we can kind of touch on as we kind of go through this, but that concept is really, really useful. And often these are in pretty darn well trained individuals, which is really the key here. And so what I did is I went through all the tapering studies that I could find, or not necessarily like taperings in the title, but there's some sort of period where I just described after training, there's a decrease in training volume for 2 to 4 weeks, and then they measured direct muscle size in some way. And so there was, I can't remember, let me pull it up here, how many I found somewhere like, so yeah, there's eight studies that I found here. And uh, ultimately, the key here is that what I did is I took each one of these studies, I looked at the training they were performing prior to this tapering period, and then I took the peak volume that they performed there, and then I took the kind of the lowest, or the volume that was the closest to when they actually measured muscle size. And if it was a multi-week taper, I tried to average all those together to kind of get the average volume performed throughout the taper. And then I created a decrease in training volume that was represented for that study. And then just kind of roughly looking at the decreases or increases in muscle size, and just looking at what the training volume change was in that study. Now, the first kind of limitation here is that many of the studies included are case studies. And so they either included one or two individuals. And specifically, the lab that they come from that does really, really interesting and really, really cool work, the one knock I'll say on them is they use very complex, training designs, which makes sense, right? Like they're coaching and trying to do research on very well trained individuals, and often that's going to come with a more complex training approach than somebody that's an untrained individual, or they just do 3 sets of 10, let progressive overload do its thing. This person has way more training under their belt, and ultimately a lot of these studies are looking at their training up into a really important competition. So things are very, very complicated. Sometimes you apply metrics, sometimes you have all different kinds of sources of training that, most of the time we're not including these sort of calculations. So when I'm looking at volume, they often in these studies provide volume load, kind of that controls for all of their training that they're doing. Obviously, that's not a perfect representation of the volume that's going towards muscle size, nor is that the most practical measurement. But in this case, that was kind of what I had to work with based on everything else. Now, the nice thing is, for the most part, at a fixed repetition range and a fixed RIR target, volume load should apply to the number of sets. So I do think there is some decent practical kind of recommendations here that can be formed from the decreases in volume load. But I just want to say that these numbers definitely should not be taken like very literally. The other thing I want to say is that the way that I did calculate those, like I said, was relative to the peak volumes that they performed prior to the tapering period. If you wanted to take the case that, if I performed super high volumes in week 2, but in week 14 is when my taper started, you want to say that those volumes are no longer relevant to where I'm kind of at. If you want to say that volume decreased from the week prior to when the taper started, the decreases in training volume that led to potential decreases in muscle size are even lower than what I'm saying. So that's the reason that I took this approach, because I thought it was really the most conservative and got us in the ballpark of those Bickle numbers. But if you think about it from that perspective, I'd be even more conservative than potentially what I'm saying, just keeping that in mind. So with that said, when we kind of take a look at all these studies, there's a really solid kind of mix of outcomes, right? You have some studies that actually allow for a small increase in muscle size following a taper, and you have some studies that see some pretty substantial losses in muscle size. I think there was one effect size that was close to 3, so a standardized mean difference of -3, which is like very substantial following a taper. So ultimately, what I wanted to get out of doing this is, like I said on the front end, I just wanted to say what is possible, or what has been observed in trained individuals, and how can we use that to help paint the results of the Bickle study and kind of put us on one side of the fence. Based on what I saw here, decreasing training volume within the range of what the Bickle study did, so somewhere within the range of 66% or greater, there is the possibility in trained individuals to see some pretty substantial losses in muscle size in the range of 2 to 4 weeks. Now, again, thinking about the way that these studies are done, there could be other reasons why those decreases in muscle size are occurring. One of them off the top of my head is when you are decreasing the total amount of training that you're doing, you're probably also decreasing the amount of muscle damage someone is kind of carrying around at a given time. That could come with just a decrease in the overall muscle swelling or edema that's kind of coming for that person in training. That said, with these being pretty darn well trained individuals, that amount of muscle damage they're going to see from a bout of exercise is going to probably be even less. So I don't know if that's a totally relevant critique, but I just wanted to bring up that there are other things other than just pure tissue muscle size that could be decreasing to establish some of these changes. So I realize these aren't perfect measurements, but once again, it's just to bring up what is even possible or what has been observed in populations that we do care about. And so ultimately, like I said, when you look at decreases in training volume that are similar to the Bickel study, pretty substantial losses in muscle size are possible. So it makes me think we should be more conservative than that for well-trained individuals that are looking to maintain or even slightly keep growing muscle size. And that brings us back to that number that the Brass study kind of looked at, right? Around that 50% numbers, probably somewhere to start. But if we're, taking in all the contextual factors, I think the most safe recommendation is probably less than 66% of a decrease in volume is probably a good place to start, to which individualization and a ton of other contextual factors will further paint that recommendation, the absolute number of sets you're performing, upper or lower body, all these things that we can kind of further kind of quantify that number with. But ultimately, the main thing I'm trying to get across here is that the Bickel study is really, really cool, but probably should stop saying for trained individuals that 1/9 of a training volume used to get your adaptations is enough to maintain them, because I don't know if I would strongly hold on to that claim based on some of the other evidence that we have.
Yeah, good stuff, man. Let's pause here. Let's give the people what they want. What's your number? Let's say you have someone that's kind of like, stock standard response, right? Kind of average response. Maybe they're rolling with like 12 sets a week on squat, 17 sets a week on bench, maybe whatever, 8 sets a week on deadlift. And you're going to a maintenance period, right? What's the number? 50%? 40% in terms of the drop?
Yeah, this is obviously largely painted the anecdotes. That's one thing I want to definitely keep in mind here. But using what we've kind of learned from this study, and then also just my coaching experience, anecdotes, all that kind of stuff, I think somewhere around 50% is going to be a really good number, especially for lower body. For upper body stuff, I would maybe bias that down a little bit lower of a decrease, but that is largely painted by my own personal experience. And I would probably just want to be a little bit more conservative with upper body muscle groups. The main thing I'm thinking about is if I cut my bench volume in half, I would lose so much strength very quickly that it would make me think, if I did that for like a 4-week period, that probably is going to come with a substantial amount of muscle loss as well. But again, that's not the same for everybody. So if you put me down and made me say a number, I think 50% is like a really solid place to start. But depending on the case, depending on certain scenarios, you could probably go more or less than that, obviously, depending on the lift, the individual, et cetera, that I'm sure we'll touch on. But 50%, I think, is probably a pretty safe place. Yeah.
So I'm curious. I'm curious about what you said about upper body, particularly bench, because you're definitely not the only one where that's the case. What do you think is going on there? Do you think it's related to muscle size, as we've kind of framed this discussion, or do you think it's related to another variable influencing strength?
I was trying to think about this a lot, and I don't really know. Like one thing I was going to initially say was that it could be that the exercises that people traditionally train for lower body could, like, for whatever reason, be a greater per set stimulus. Obviously, the topic as of late could be like longer muscle lengths or peak tension at longer muscle lengths, whereas the upper body, maybe that's not the case. You think about back training, you think about biceps, think about lateral delts, stuff like that.
Higher arch benching.
Yeah, higher arch benching was the next one. The
Yeah.
counter to that is, like, if you do a ton of dumbbell benching as well, then maybe that's not the case. But I was definitely, for myself, thinking about high
Yeah.
arch benching and decreasing that bench volume,
Mhm.
to which every set maybe um, means a little bit more to kind of the total tension that you're trying to accumulate. Whereas if you're getting a couple of really high quality sets that are challenging in a long muscle length, and also just achieve pretty long muscle lengths in general, maybe that is going to allow you to maintain on a little bit less. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It also could be the absolute volume thing you're talking about, right? Um, I always struggle with that though, because I kind of, with this kind of discussion, I add squat and deadlift together for the most part, because I think that allows for kind of a better comparison with that and bench. But but yeah, that could also be at play here. Is if you take bench from 24 to 12 sets, maybe that's just simply not the same as taking squat and deadlift from 12 to 6. That potentially could be something as well, but I'm not sure. What do you think?
No, I'm not sure either.
Does that fit your experience though?
What specifically?
I guess adding yourself into your coaching experience, um, bench seems to be more sensitive to
For
decrease.
sure. For some people, for some
Yeah.
people. And definitely like on average that one seems to be the most sensitive. I do wonder, to kind of circle back around to the absolute volume versus relative volume things, is like if you're going from 12 sets to 6 sets on squat, you're only dropping 6 sets, you're only dropping 6 unracks. Whereas if you go from, typically these people we're talking about maybe are benching with 20 plus sets a week, let's say 25, right? They go from 25 to 12 or 13 sets. They're missing out on 12 to 13 unracks, setups, etc. So there might be an absolute consideration there. It's also just probably the most technical lift for, again, especially for these types of this kind of archetype of powerlifter that we kind of have in our minds right now. Um, but I think probably the more important take home here is like, just like we talk about with like RAR recommendations of like, yeah, got to take everything to 1 to 3 RAR or 10 to 20 sets per muscle group. Like, again, we don't have any issues with that. Like, just like how we're talking about dropping your training volume to 1/3 is probably a safer bet than 1/9, or, and stated differently, dropping your training volume by 66% is probably a better kind of rule of thumb. All three of those examples, right? RAR recommendations, set volume recommendations, and these maintenance volume recommendations are 100% going to be subject to individualization. So, and just like how we've talked about with those other variables in the podcast and in previous episodes, it's probably going to be lift dependent. So, as always, right, these are things to, we're just trying to probably move that starting point target, and it's going to be pretty lifter dependent, in my experience. But to circle back to a few minutes ago, I would generally agree with that 50% number, right? That's where my head goes first, is like, how do I feel about, putting this lift on the back burner for 2 months, and I'm going to be pretty dang confident we're going to be within striking distance of your all-time best, or where you're currently at, right? 50% that cutoff for
Do
me.
do you still feel that way when we move it to the bench example? So somebody's benching 24 sets, you move them to 12.
I think so. I think you're within striking distance on average. Yeah, but I don't know. Now that I say that
It
out
does.
loud,
It does.
I
Yeah, I
might bump
say
it up a little
it
bit.
does. It does feel weird to me, right?
It
Yeah.
depends on the lifter, right? If
Yeah.
I think about some of the, like, my stronger guys that are like, uh, you know, could probably be characterized as 1.5 times per week benching. So it's like one hard bench day, one, day kind of resembling a power day. Um, cut their volume in half, no problem, right? They're probably happy about it. Um, Whereas, those guys that are need 25 plus sets a week to progress, yeah, cutting it in half, I'm starting to get a little bit nervous about. Um, so yeah, probably there is something to that absolute volume.
The other thing I'm thinking about is if the route of decreasing the volume comes from decreases in frequency, that's obviously coming with a lot of other hidden volume from warm ups, especially if you're working up to a top set. So I think I'd feel better about it is, let's say we have a 5 times a week bencher and you just decrease sets from every single one of those sessions, but kept 5 times a week benching, same number of top sets, same number of warm ups, et cetera, and literally just decreasing back off sets. I think I feel better about that, in which 50% I think could be still within. The other thing I'll say, which I think is a good tangent to kind of roll into some other benefits of decreasing volume potentially, maybe a little bit more aggressively. I think bench also comes back the fastest. If it does decrease a little bit, I think it's easiest to potentially ramp up frequency, ramp up volume for most people, of course, particularly of this archetype we're kind of discussing. If it does get deprioritized a little bit, there just seems to be like this, artificial increase you get from increasing the frequency on bench press more so than the other lifts, like squat and deadlift. You kind of have it or you don't, and it's going to take, however long to build it kind of like normal. Whereas bench press, I do feel like, you drop down somebody down to 3 times a week bench and you're deprioritizing it or whatever, you increase them back to 5 times a week per as normal. It just kind of goes up a level and then you start to go normally from there again. So I think that's something else to keep in mind, that, you know, maintenance is obviously the goal, but a slight decrease may not always be a bad target either. Obviously depending on the situation, but other thing I put down here, Josh, that could be a potential thing to keep in mind when decreasing things is we're coming back to this resensitization conversation, is that maintenance and the dose required for physiological resensitization may not be the same. And if you asked me today what I think the relationship between those two things are, I would say they're not the same. Based on, I think I have a stronger opinion on this than you potentially, though. So I'm curious to get your thoughts there. But I would say that coming back to this, specialization cycle conversation that we've had, in order to meaningfully elicit resensitization, I think the decreases in dose needs to be like pretty substantial, where a 50% resensitization or 50% decrease, kind of the whole point of this entire conversation, right, is that you're not losing that much. And so to me, in order to substantially resensitize yourself, you probably do need to have some sort of, cost in order to do that. Now, the whole question of, does that get you to a higher point after we do multiple kind of runs of this resensitization process? We still don't know that. But just from a theoretical perspective, I'm curious on what you think on that.
Unfortunately, you're probably right to some degree, but to me, it's a matter of degree, right? Um, like, if you think about some of the potential mechanisms by which resensitization, as we talked about in the last episode, might occur, those are probably going to correspond with decreases in muscle mass. Would you generally agree with that? Like,
Yeah, I think so.
ultimately, that's where my head's at. But we don't know that for sure, right? Because like, let's think about like ribosomes, for example. When you initiate a training program after being like detrained, you're going to see an increase in ribosomal capacity, so an increase in the number of ribosomes. Um, the fact that your body essentially adapted to a reduced ribosome capacity means that muscle protein synthesis was downregulated. And okay, that's okay. We're just maintaining, but you got to keep in mind that that's required to some degree to maintain, right? So that might be kind of an indicator that you are losing muscle mass. Um, but to jump right to it and to cut through the fluff, we just don't know. And I hope, kind of going back to last episode, that those are differentiated more than I just described, but they very well might be. Um, yeah, that's kind of where my head's at right now.
You heard it here first. Hypertrophy periodization in 20 years is everybody finding the amount of volume needed for physiological resensitization on the individual level that doesn't result in large losses in muscle size, and then you increase it to as much as you can recover from and just keep cycling there. That's my hunch. So ultimately,
You're kind of memeing, but kind of serious
no,
too, right?
I'm
Yeah.
serious. I'm
Okay.
serious. I think
Yeah,
ultimately
because like
that's what it turns into.
that kind of checks out.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's what it is. It's just like, I definitely think, based on the data that we have, you need substantial drops in training dose to elicit physiological resensitization. But we probably don't want to do that to the maximal degree, because that's going to result in us decreasing the baseline in which we're trying to increase the rate of muscle growth from. So ultimately, and to me, instead of looking for the number of sets that I do, I'm looking for the range of kind of what I'm trying to go back and forth between. The way you navigate there has been a topic of large discussion, I think, in the last couple of years for hypertrophy training. But I think the thing we're more so saying is just this concept of physiological resensitization is the thing we need to figure out first, why does that occur? How do we make it occur? And then how do we minimize the downsides to get the desired effect? Because ultimately that's what's going to allow us to increase the rate of muscle growth when we're kind of doing the training that we think, based on a ton of work in the last couple of years, is going to allow us to maximize that. But we know those diminishing returns come eventually. The question is, particularly for muscle mass, can we get those to kind of reaccelerate to allow us to see meaningful progress? And kind of, I think that's a really good answer for the question of like, what are you going to do? Just keep doing more volume? Like, I think that's a really good question, for kind of progression for hypertrophy long term. Is like, we're just trying to make every single set that we do the same amount of efficacy over time by doing some sort of intervention that continues to make us sensitive to training. But that's a whole nother conversation. But I do think that's honestly, like you said, half meme, half serious. If you took my guess on where hypertrophy training will be in 20 years, that's kind of going to be you can do pretty much any load you want. You can do pretty much any rep range you want. You can pretty much do a wide range of RARs. You can do a ton of different exercises. But the thing you're kind of trying to dial in is similar to strength. Strength is in almost every study predicted by the load you train with or the load you allow yourself to reach based on the other factors, fatigue management, et cetera. I think hypertrophy training is going to be what allows you to, benefit the most from the sets you're doing. So that can either be from doing more sets because you haven't reached the point to which those sets are no longer put like meaningfully more efficacious, or it's going to be another one of these strategies that after you've reached that cap, what can we do to make sure that the sets that we're doing continue to be efficacious as opposed to strong diminishing returns over the course of training or as you add additional sets. That to me is kind of the magic sauce hopefully we'll find eventually.
Yeah, just a word of caution. That kind of more extreme approach that we're kind of interested in and intrigued by is probably not where we'd hedge our bets
Nah,
in
bro.
the
Carvalho with colleagues, bro.
yeah. Oh my god. Like again, it's important to keep in mind that it has to be a sliding scale, right? Like it just has to be. And we talked about in the last podcast how the specialization approach probably doesn't have a huge downside if you're not doing it dramatically. And again, emphasis on not doing it dramatically.
And now we have
Um,
that defined, at least roughly.
what's that?
And now we have that defined, at least
Right.
roughly, which was kind of my goal with all this is
Right.
like,
So yeah, awesome. What right? That this is really good information to have. 50% again. I think that's kind of evidence based. We have this 66 number that Zach kind of converged on from the data.
I think your 20 to 40 on both sides actually makes perfect sense. That's kind of what I
Hmm.
was thinking now is that, you know, that 20 number on the decreasing end, that's obviously being very conservative.
Hmm.
Maybe in the bench press case, maybe that's the number you're going to go with, but up to that 40, I think you're in a really good spot. Now, if we start crossing that line into 50 to 66 or so, that's the range of like, if I'm trying to maximize the potential resensitization while minimizing downsides, I think that's where you want to be. And then you just kind of, if you want to be increasingly more conservative, kind of depending on what your goal is, then you just kind of keep sliding up to that 20 where you kind of said on the positive end. I think those also make sense on the reverse end now and there. I think that makes, things really, really simple.
Right. Right. Um, and again, those numbers again might be a reasonable range for now, but are subject to individualization. So yeah, it's a sliding scale, right? And if you're going to if you're going to resensitize to training with a drop to 1/3 of your previous training volumes, you're still probably going to resensitize to training with a drop to 2/3 of your training volume, but probably just to a lesser extent. I don't think it would make sense for there to be like a cutoff point where like that relationship changes. It might, right? But I can't think of a rationale for that to be the case. So yeah, I feel pretty comfortable doubling down with what we have now, right? I'm not comfortable in this claim as being right, but I'm comfortable in saying this is probably a decent starting point based on kind of our practical input and also based on where the research is at right now. That if you're going to kind of take this specialization cycle approach, or you just find yourself in a situation of wanting to maintain for everything or maintaining for certain things and or specializing a certain lift or certain muscle groups, that 20 to 40% changes in each direction is going to be a solid starting point to experiment with. Um, So yeah, would you agree with that? If so, and you kind of give me the thumbs up, then I have a question for you that's still in the practical end. Okay, cool. So we frame this around hypertrophy because that's where a lot of the data is. And we kind of talked about bench, and we talked about how bench, is a pretty technical lift. So maybe that's contributing to short-term decreases in performance as a result of decreased volumes. But I guess my question for you is just more broadly: do you think that strength is a reasonable thing to look at when kind of evaluating responses to decreases or increases in volume, as I just described? Um, just because a lot goes into strength, right? And you know, yeah. I'll cut myself off there because I know you're about to go.
There's a reason I only wrote this on muscle size. I guess that's the first thing I'll say is that I was initially going to write this on both. And then started sitting down and thinking about it. And I was like, man, this is completely confounded by, the benefits that we see from tapering. Like you can't say that, okay, decreasing volume is good for strength if we're looking at the studies that we have that decrease volume for this amount of time, right? All the other studies that we have on high and low volumes, I think, are a slight indication we could potentially talk about it, because this is just a con in all of the volume research that some studies acknowledge and some studies don't, is that if you have trained subjects, they're doing training before the training study, right? So within every single study, in addition to the absolute volumes they're performing, there also is a relative change in training volume, which is why volume studies now acknowledge this, and they try to have a homogenization period prior to the kind of the experimental part of the study where they stratify people into different volumes, to try to control for this in some fashion, that change in training volume entering the intervention. But broadly speaking, for strength, the volume studies that we have don't see nearly as strong of a relationship for strength and volume as they do hypertrophy. You'll often see, like, when people cite the Schoenfeld and the Ralston meta-analysis, the phrasing that we use also, because I think it's fair, is that the dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and albeit to a lesser extent strength, that's kind of the way it's usually phrased. And I think that basically says is that most of these studies measure strength and hypertrophy. That same individual that's coming into the study at a fixed change in training volume isn't necessarily seeing way worse gains with lower volumes for strength. So to me, that somewhat indicates that you can drop training volume lower and still maintain strength better. The obvious caveat here is that most of the time, what is constituting a strength test is way different than what we're talking about in practice. If I take a experienced power lifter with an over 400 Wilks and we're talking about their squat, the strength task that we're describing there is very different than a 1RM leg extension, even a 1RM, Smith squat, or whatever that is. That's the closest that we have. Once again, I don't think that necessarily changes the directionality. It's probably just the magnitude at which we can drop the volume and still maintain adaptation. So, long story short, I have no idea. And I think these are strongly confounded with the acute effects that we see from tapering. But given that the relationship between volume and strength is not nearly as strong as volume and hypertrophy, and tapering does seem to be a thing, I think it's probably substantially lower. I don't know if I can even put a number on that of like what I would be comfortable with, but this is one of the things I will say that also is kind of, it brings volume allocation into it a little bit as well, is that volume allocation, I have seen very, very wide shifts in volume allocation be totally fine. So like I've seen, like, taking somebody from doing 3 times a week squatting, you know, somebody that's like very constantly fatigued and potentially has an injury history, taking them down to one of the most conservative approaches I have some individuals on, which is literally like one top set on the competition lift per week. I've seen that be effective many times. Now, the absolute volume that they're performing is still within similar, ranges, maybe a little bit lower to what they were performing with a higher frequency, higher volume approach on the lift that we care about. But it's just that volume is allocated to very non-specific means. So then raises another question in the case of strength. what volume are you talking about? Are you talking about the volume on the lift? Or are you talking about the volume for the muscle? Those probably are responsible for two different adaptations. So I think it just gets really, really difficult to know what you're actually talking about. But if you're going to hold hold my arm down, I definitely think you could probably get away with lower or greater decreases in volume and still be able to maintain or slightly build strength. I think Pack's work, shout out Pack, probably plays into that as well. The key, I think, there is often for that, people are okay with really increasing the load to compensate for that. And load is going to be the thing that's probably the most, retentive of strength in the face of lower volume. So I think, especially if you're performing very high load efforts regularly, I think you're going to be able to drop volume considerably more than hypertrophy and be able to maintain that. Um, yeah, how long that goes, I'm not entirely sure, but that was a long answer to say I don't really know.
I just learned a new word today, retentive.
I was banking on that being a word. I
It is
heard it.
definitely a word. I have the definitions pulled up. The number one on Google is having the ability to remember facts and impressions easily. It doesn't really apply. Number two, able to absorb and hold moisture. It doesn't really apply. And I hate to break it to you, but there's no number three. It's a word, but it probably wasn't the right
No,
word.
retentive it definitely works there because you're trying to retain, the moisture in the muscle to be able to perform
Mm-hmm.
1 RM tasks. That's what I was going
Mm-hmm.
for. So
Mm-hmm.
hashtag
Yeah.
retentive in the comments, and yeah, we'll know you listened.
Yeah, we can divert to sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy. Okay, so with that out of the way, yeah, I mean, I just the more we kind of talk about this, um, I just think it's going to be so subject to individualization. Even obviously that goes for everything, but even more so than some other training variables. I think because um, even if on average, and I would agree with you that people can probably maintain strength with lower volumes, then they can maintain muscle size, right? In a relative sense. But obviously, eventually, that decrease in muscle size, if you're below that threshold for maintaining muscle size, is going to lead to a decrease in strength. Um, that's essentially tapering to some degree. So you might be able to get away with that for the order of weeks. But then, it just kind of depends what the bottleneck is for an individual for their strength, right? If they need those 25 unracks and setups on bench, um, and all that skill practice, then their maintenance for strength might be way higher in a relative sense than their maintenance for muscle size. Um, I start to think about periodization now, right? Because if you're kind of moving into more of the intensification side of things, to use kind of an old school periodization term, um, volume load might go down a decent bit, but strength will theoretically go up. Is that typically enough to maintain muscle size? How does that influence kind of our periodization models, et cetera? I don't think we need to go into that necessarily. That's probably a whole nother discussion in and of itself, but I wanted to kind of name drop that, if you will, just as another consideration for how these concepts we've discussed today might apply.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like the thing I've been thinking about a ton recently, just based on a lot of the discussions we've had on the podcast, which is always cool. Like this is just kind of a meta conversation, but we talk all the time and we talk about this stuff all the time. But almost always there's something on the podcast that's extremely thought
Hmm.
provoking that we had no idea or even remotely planned
We don't
for.
do this for you. We do it for
Yeah,
us.
literally. Um, yeah, and a lot of our recent conversations has it just made me think kind of how periodization should be operated, I guess. And I think this is always kind of the case, but I think it maybe being a little bit more transparent about it would be beneficial both on the group and individual level. And I guess what I mean is like periodization, by definition, you're kind of having phasic training, right? And every phase of training presumably has a specific goal. And if you're having a specific goal, there probably should be a way to evaluate that goal. And then I think that goal is basically how you individualize within that periodized framework. And I think as we gain more information, the way to test said goal or the goal itself changes. And this is a very wide scoping conversation, but I just think like I've been reevaluating what is the goal, and then how do I best evaluate that goal within the frameworks that we usually operate from, right? So like we talked about with the resensitization stuff, how could I test whether resensitization or specialization was effective both in the on and the off cycle? And this is also the case of like uh, how could I test whether strength was benefited with lower volumes in that strength phase or whatever. Like just it brings up additional questions that I think take some time to think about how you would test that. Um, that I just think probably changes the ultimate application, especially on the individual level, if you're really attentive to how you're testing that. And I think there's some good stuff here that I've been chewing on that hopefully we can distill into practical information eventually.
Yeah. And we could probably give a little shout out to DUP as well, right? Because to some degree, that's the thinking as to why undulating days throughout the week, in addition to fatigue management, which is I think probably nowadays the primary lens people think of it through. But if you kind of go to like the original DUP stuff for like strength day, hypertrophy day, power day, to some degree like that helps us with these problems or some of the problems we've been talking about today in terms of having enough to maintain, but maybe shifting that emphasis over time. So wanted to throw that in there as well. Got anything to say on that or anything else?
No, that was just a super cool shout out.
Yeah, shout out
Shout
to
out
DUP,
to the DUP. Yep.
the DUP. Yeah, with that, thank you guys for listening to this podcast. We make this podcast for you. We appreciate you listening. We have a lot of other things we could have discussed, so but we got to go. So thank you for listening. Share this with a friend, leave a rating,
Or an enemy.
and yeah, or an enemy. And we'll see you back for episode 49 in a couple weeks. Take care, guys.
Thanks, guys.